couple things before we get started. I finally got a hold of Dennis today. I've tried a couple different times last week, and he wouldn't answer his phone. He wouldn't call me back, but he's doing better. He's still got a few more antibiotics to take or whatever, but he is improving. He's lost almost 30 pounds now, but he is doing better. Kenny said that Dawn Baumgartner, of course, is down at Texas, and Vanna went with her. They'll be down there a few more days. They're starting to figure out what kind of treatments to give her and get her started on, so keep her in your prayers. Jennifer Alley doesn't really post anything on Facebook that I see that how she's doing or feeling, but is anybody... Okay, that's what I wondered, if the treatments were how they were affecting her. So, okay. So keep Jennifer in your prayers. I saw Kenny the other day. Kenny is just Kenny. I know Franny has to see him every day, and she might say something different, but he always asks about, the first thing he does, he asks about how everybody else is doing, and he starts naming off names. So for the condition that he's in, it's really amazing to me to go talk to him and go see him. It kind of makes you really more appreciate the health that you have when you go see him. But if you get a minute, go see him. We could do anything like that we wanted to. He'd love it. But yeah, just keep him in your prayers, and yeah, I'm sure he wouldn't mind that a bit. But anyway, so keep these in your prayers as we always do. So Jeff, would you mind leading us in prayer?
Almighty Father in heaven, we humbly bow before you as your servants. We thank you, Father, for another wonderful day. We thank you, Father, for your word. We ask, Father, that you be with Brother Kevin and all the teachers here tonight. Help them to provide the word that we may apply it to our lives and to all that we do. We ask that you give us the strength and the opportunity to share this word with others when we get the opportunity. We ask this humbly in your own precious name.
Well, when we left out of here last week, we were down starting question 20. So I go home and I start looking at that. And at the same time, Donna had asked the question last week, about degrees of punishment or whatever. So I started looking into that a little bit because I thought, well, we've only got a few questions, and maybe once we get through that, then we can maybe address her question. The more I looked at her question, the more I said, no, we don't want to spend 10 minutes with that question. So my plan is to, I think we still have an extra day or an extra Wednesday night in this quarter that we won't have material. So my plan is at the end of this material for this quarter is to look at your question, Donna. So I haven't forgot about you. And in the meantime, that gives you 3 months to be looking ahead at degrees of punishment. Look into it. I had formed an opinion, but once I've started looking at it, I need to change my opinion. So if you get some minutes, some time, take a look at that. With that being said, I looked at what we had left to finish tonight, and I thought, well, okay, we'll start the next quarter. But then I got thinking about it, looking at it again. We spent the first 19 questions in 1 John. We got, 2 questions for 2 John, 1 question for 3 John, 1 question for Jude, and then 4 or 5 for Revelation. It's like, we need to probably spend just a little bit more time on these couple of books here. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time. We could spend a year on Revelation, which we're not going to do that right now. But I think tonight I've got enough material, enough things to talk about that I think we can justify or probably fill up the entire time wrapping up Lesson 12. And then I promise I'll do my best. Foreseeing any catastrophe, we will start Lesson 1 next week. I know most of you are probably already ready. So anyway, it gives you an extra week just to start being ahead. So go ahead next week, look at Lesson 2 and everything, and you'll just be that farther ahead. But anyway, we're going to spend this evening on wrapping up Lesson number 12. And so hopefully you won't be too disappointed. I didn't give you a whole lot of background information on some of this last week. So, of course, who do we attribute 1st, 2nd, 3rd John to being the author? John. Yeah, the Apostle John, okay? And believe it or not, there are some skeptics that say maybe John didn't write 2nd and 3rd John. I think as you read it as you see the style that he writes it in, and you look at the Gospel of John, you look at 1 John, and from 99.9% of the scholars, they all agree that that the Apostle John wrote this. What's interesting, of course, in 2nd and 3rd John, he identifies himself as the elder. And the thought there is he's not addressing himself as an elder of the church, but as an elder being older in age. It is thought that all of these books, even the Gospel of John, were written pretty late in his life. So that's kind of why he addresses. Then he kind of uses the term, or he doesn't kind of. He uses the term as he addresses, my children, little children or whatever. So it kind of gives you that emphasis or that thought of, a father figure speaking to children. So that seems to be the consensus as to why he addresses those two books as the elder. It's thought that all of his books, all 5 of them, were written, like I said, around the same time. And more than likely, probably well after the deaths of all the other apostles, the others that wrote books. He seems to be probably the last one that survives, that outlives all of them. So they were all written somewhere around AD 90, give or take a few years. And just prior to the persecution that Domitian brings forth there around AD 94. And we know that John died close to the end of the 1st century. So again, all these books were written pretty close to the time that he dies. He was the son of Zebedee, who was a well-to-do fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. He had a younger brother named James. From John chapter 1, verses 34 or 35 through 39, we can infer that he was first a disciple of John the Baptist, and then later left John's teaching as John even decreased his preaching for Christ's increase. So John goes over and follows Jesus. And we know that John is very close to Jesus. Jesus and John, are very extremely close. The disciple whom he loved, exactly. But what's interesting as well is there's really not a lot of historical information about John. Even though he writes 5 books of the New Testament, he writes 1/5, if you think about it, 1/5 of the New Testament. Yet his name, John, only appears 5 times. And all 5 of those times is in the book of Revelation. His name never appears in any of the others until you get to Revelation. I thought that was interesting. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to focus more on what Jesus did, while the Gospel of John tells us more about how Jesus felt and what he thought. So John's writing a little different than the other 3. And it seems that John's function was to supplement the writings of the others and to close forevermore the writings of the Bible, which he did when he penned the final words in the book of Revelation. And those words, of course, fulfilled Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians 13, where he talked about that all prophecies will cease, fail, tongues will cease, and all this supernatural knowledge will end. So when John closes out Revelation, he closed out the entire our Bible. That was it. It was done, finished, complete. Again, just a little bit of tidbits, a little background on John and some of his writings. So with that being said, we'll jump into 2 John. Like I said, our paper only had the 2 questions, and they really aren't really questions. It's just kind of more statements, and you just kind of read it off the card. But 2 John, of course, a very short book, only 13 verses. The theme is pretty much to love one another. Its purpose seems to be to express joy for their walk in the faith for these people he's addressing, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Verse 4. to exhort them to continue walking after the commandments of love, verse 5 and 6, and then to encourage them not to bring false teachers into their fellowship, verses 9 through 11. And we'll talk about this in just a minute. Well, that seems to be the focus of the one question that our questions kind of go to, or goes after, I guess, whatever. What's interesting about this, and actually, I don't know if I've really have sat in any classes like Bill or David teaching on 2nd and 3rd John. Maybe I was teaching one of the other classes or something. But anyway, when I first started reading through this, and you start thinking about the elect lady, when we hear about a feminine in the New Testament, what do we kind of think? What do we usually think about? I usually associate that with the church. Yeah, okay, and that's kind of the bride. Yeah, the bride of Christ. And so when I started first reading through that, okay, it's probably talking about the church. No, it isn't, because when you look at, and I don't know anything about Greek, so I'm pulling this from other people, but when you look at the Greek words for this elect lady, and you look at the Greek word for the church, what's the Greek word for church? Remember? Ecclesia, the called out, okay? But when you look at the Greek words for this elect lady, that's exactly what the Greek is, an elect lady, a lady elected. And so you really got to make a stretch to say that this elect lady is the church. And you really got to make it more of a stretch to say that this is referring to the church, because if that's the case, then what are her children? The church doesn't have children. There's no other, branch from the church. That would almost take us to denominationalism. So you really would have to really stretch the Greek from what I'm gathering from other writers to make that applied to the church. So really what this really more than likely, and all of the scholars, most of them, agree to, is this is actually a person, a lady that John was as familiar with, a lady that he had actually stayed in her home at some point in time. And her name could have been Lady Electique, if I'm saying it right. Let me see how to spell it. You guys tell me how. Eclecte. Elects, something like that. And then another one that even said that her name possibly could have been, and somehow they derived this from some of the Greek, her name could have even been Cyria, Cyria. Doesn't really matter. She's a devout, faithful Christian lady that Paul knows. So this letter is actually written to a person, and it's talking about a person. He is talking to a person. This lady is a faithful disciple. She has faithful children. She was given to hospitality, as John mentions, because he's even saying, I want to soon to be with you again. I want to soon come back into your company. And she also has a faithful sister who possibly has passed away, if you read down in verse 13. But she has or had a faithful sister that also had faithful children. So he is really commending her for the life that she's living and the example she's been to her family. And what I thought when I read through that, we could put names out of people here into that same spot. I think about your mom, Inez, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. Her name could go right there. She was a devout, faithful Christian and had faithful children. Don't mean to put Nettie on the spot, but you put Nettie right in there. She's got faithful children and grandchildren. And there's others that you could put in there. So the example that we lead, the example of the life that we live, people see it. People knows it. John knew about her. John was writing a letter to her. Interesting that he's writing a letter just to her. He is, admonishing her for her faith, for her faithfulness, for her teaching her children. We don't hear it. There's nothing mentioned about her husband. We have to assume she had a husband, she had children. So he could have been deceased. Or maybe he was just an unbeliever, but there's nothing mentioned about him at all. From verse 10, we learn that she was accustomed to receiving teachers of the word into her house. He encouraged her to continue to love one another and to walk in the commandments of God. And then he goes into the meat of the book that I really want us to focus on for a few minutes, is about these false teachers and how we need to handle them, how we need to approach them. So if you're not already there in 2 John, turn into 2 John, and we're going to read a few verses. I'm going to read verse 9, 10, and 11. It says, "Whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into your house nor greet him. For he who greets him shares in his evil deeds." So, right on face value, if we know that somebody is a false teacher, how are we supposed to treat them? If you just read these verses and not really think about anything else, how would you think we should treat somebody that we would know is a false teacher?
You still love them, but you don't receive them as a brother. First and foremost, he's not talking about brother.
Right.
He's talking about community.
Yeah. Okay. He's not talking about a false teacher. A brother in Christ is a false teacher. He's talking about somebody that is outside of Christ, that is a false teacher. And we know there were numerous ones of these, weren't there? I mean, they all, they were after John the Baptist when John was preaching, and then they just came right in with Christ, as Christ, started preaching. And actually, they were after Christ really from the time he was born. Herod was out to kill him the day he was born, basically. So false teachers, people trying to prove or disprove Christianity, trying to destroy Christianity, there were a lot of them back in the first century, a lot of them. And so when you first read this, it says, don't invite them into your house, don't even greet them. John's not talking about being mean to somebody, being disrespectful to someone. How are we to treat one another? How are we to treat people even out in the world? We're supposed to do good to all men, right? As Christians, we're supposed to be kind. We're supposed to be gentle, meek, all that kind of stuff. We're supposed to be good to people. So John isn't talking about, don't even talk to these people. Don't have anything to do with them. There would be nothing wrong with bringing them into your house if you're trying to teach them what's right. What John is saying, don't bring them into your house, don't have fellowship with them, and don't do anything that is going to promote what they're preaching, what they're teaching. But don't be mean to them. Don't be disrespectful to them. Pardon me? Civil and polite. We still need to be hospitable. Okay? Yes, exactly. We are to make disciples, and we're not going to do that by alienating anyone. Right. You're exactly right. And that's what this point is. That's what he's trying to make. Don't do anything that's going to further their cause. That's what he's telling her. That's what he is telling this lady, to do, how to conduct herself. And of course, we know at this time, were there Holiday Inns, Marriott's, Hampton Inns? Was any of that around? No, they didn't have that. There wasn't even a Hollywood Motel. I can't believe that there wouldn't be one of those, but there wasn't. So people, if they had an extra room or rooms, they would rent them out to travelers. And so that is why that's why John is admonishing her, is telling her, be careful who you keep in your house. He's not telling her don't keep them, don't necessarily throw them out, don't allow them to stay, but be careful.
This has something to do with, linking up and having a fellowship Christian dinner with the Baptist church down the road.
Exactly.
They're seeing
Exactly.
That's the way I take it.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
have a friend come over that's, I haven't seen in 30 years. He spends the night at my house. He's not a godly man at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's what.
We all have friends that are not Christians. We all live in the world, work in the world. We're going to have friends, acquaintances that aren't Christians. You got family that's not Christians, and some have family that are more than not Christians. They're, I don't know. But yeah, exactly. These are people that are trying to destroy the gospel of Christ. Exactly.
You must be careful to not be consumed by what they're bringing to you.
Exactly.
You have to be strong enough to reject their ideas or their religious philosophies.
Exactly.
Don't let them persuade you.
Yes. Yep. And that's what he's trying to tell her, or what he's writing to her. Don't let them influence you. You influence them. Don't let them influence you. Applies to us today. We need to be the salt of the world. We need to be the light of the world. Don't let them do it the other way to you. So with that being said, number 19, the book that shows we cannot help false teachers is 2 John. If we support and encourage false teachers, we become what? We're complicit with them. We're like them. We're sharing in their evil deeds is what the verse says. Partakers in what they're doing. Yeah. Yeah. So be careful. And, and even to Jeff's point, like having some kind of a fellowship dinner, with a denomination or doing something in conjunction with a denomination. And we see that a lot. And we get a lot of stuff in the mail, what's the one that comes out maybe about this time of the year, maybe, for the holding hand things across the nation, or a prayer, day of prayer, or, it isn't that we don't want to partake in that, and it isn't that we don't want to pray for everyone or pray for the nation or whatever, but it looks like you're, again, that you're helping their cause. And so that's why we elect not to, at least this congregation, I can't speak for others, but that's why we elect not to do some of these things. And I know we get questioned, or sometimes you might have questions, well, why aren't we participating in this? We've got to be careful on how this looks. Are we promoting their cause, which is false? Yeah. Yep. Same thing.
I was in a meeting one time where a gospel preacher was trading pulpits with denominations. I don't use that term very often. Religious assemblies
Yeah.
is my terminology. And somebody told him he was doing wrong. He said, I'm not asking your permission. I'm going to go ahead and do it. That way I can teach them the gospel.
There's other ways to do it besides that.
So once you allow him to be all about people.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I would hope. Yeah, maybe they didn't have an eldership, but yeah, I would hope that an eldership would not allow that to be done. Okay. Any other thing? Yeah, I think we're not going to make it through this. We don't go on. But anyway, all right. Let's move into John 13. John. 3 John. There we go. Again, another short another short book, 14 verses. And this one is written to a man named Gaius. Beloved friend of John. And this was a common name in the Roman Empire. John's prayer for him is to prosper financially and to be in good health. The theme seems to be commendations for his Christian courtesy. He was a good Christian man, a hospitable man. The purpose of the 3 epistles of John are personal in nature and emphasize Christian relationships with Christian doctrine. This letter is to encourage and commend Gaius for his faithful walk in the truth, and it also serves as a warning against prominent false teachers who dwelt among them. Specifically, there a man named Diotrephes, thank you, Bill, is mentioned in here. But Gaius is loved by John for his walk, in the truth. He was very hospitable. He was liberal with his possessions. He provided for those that were traveling through the area, what we would term missionaries today. You can read about that in verses 5 through 8. He is warned about this guy named Diotrephes, who was a prideful man, out of verse 9. He loved to have the praise of man, verses 9 and 10. And he was very power hungry. He is told to be aware of this man. Again, not necessarily a false teacher, but one that was creating havoc, creating division within the church.
The impression you get, he is in the church.
Yes,
But
exactly.
and certainly, we've seen many of us that have many years in the church have seen congregations split wide open by people that are the elders or not elders, whatever, but all of a sudden think they have a powerful position.
Exactly.
And they are descendants of Diotrephes.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, this man was he wanted to be preeminence over everything else, over everyone else. Demetrius is talked about in this book, verse 12. He had a good report among all men. He was a man who stood for the truth. And what's interesting, and if you'll recall, in Acts chapter 19, verses 24 and 28, talks about a silversmith named at Ephesus named Demetrius. And he was an evil man. He was not a good man at all. Probably this is not the same man, but if it is, he would obviously have repented and obeyed. But more than likely, it is not the same man. It's possible. I couldn't find anyone that would say yes or no 100% one way or the other, because what I did see was that Gaius was a very common name in the Roman Empire. So, I can't say yay or nay. Did you find anything that kind of led more that it probably was the same one? It's probably more than likely it probably is the same one. But I couldn't find anybody that jumped in there and said, yeah, it definitely was. With that being said, 21, the book that shows we are to help teachers of the truth, 3 John. And that's what Gaius is being commended for. His hospitality, his help in those that were traveling through teaching the gospel, missionaries as we would call it. Same way that we today help. Not all of us have the ability or have the means or can go out and be like a missionary, go to a foreign land, or even be like Ray Gordon, come from a foreign land into our land. Not all of us can do that. But how can we help? We can help. How do we do that? Financially, by giving. So as we give to help these, we're helping in that effort. We have a part in that, even though we're not physically doing the work. All right, we got to move along. The next book we're going to talk about is Jude. Again, an interesting book, only small but short book, 25 verses. Jude is the brother of James. He's one of the sons of Joseph and Mary. So what does that make him? Half brother to Christ. Yeah. What's interesting is he doesn't talk to him. He doesn't say that he is, oh, look at me, I'm Jesus' brother. No, he doesn't say that at all. If anything, it's absolutely the opposite. He is very humble. He is very meek. Very little is known about him, actually. We do know that he was not an apostle. He seems to be very modest, very humble in nature. He doesn't rank himself high, considering that he is related, a blood relative to Christ. And actually, in verse 1, he refers himself as a servant of Jesus Christ. That's how he considers himself. Same as us. We are servants of Christ.
Seriously, thinking about his name, that was a popular name among Jews because that was the name of the famous revolt leader back in the 2nd century BC, Judas Maccabeus.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of name the kids Jude or Judas.
Yeah.
After Judas not bad.
Yep, that's exactly right. Again, he doesn't rely on his relationship with Christ to prove that his words are true. And also from Matthew's list, where Matthew lists the sons of Joseph and Mary, he is mentioned last. In Mark's account, he is listed third. So what the scholars get out of that is he probably was either the youngest son or next to the youngest of the children, particularly the sons of Joseph and Mary. According to John 7, verses 3 through 8, he, along with the rest of the brothers of Jesus, do you remember what those verses talk about? The brothers of Jesus, were they believers? No, they didn't believe. So he is listed in there with other brothers as being an unbeliever of the deity of Jesus. However, as you go forward, particularly after the resurrection and Jesus' ascension, they were all there with Mary in the upper room in Jerusalem after Christ's ascension. So at some point in time, they believed. They were convicted of Jesus' deity. They believed who he was, who he claimed, but you believe his claims.
John was asked to care for Mary because boys weren't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At the scene of the cross, they still weren't there. It took the resurrection before they were convinced of his deity. Yeah. Acts 1 verse 14 indicates that he was married, appears to have traveled considerably and to have been accompanied by his wife on his journeys, as he was missionary journeys, I guess, again, if you want to call them that. It's written, the book is written to them that are called beloved in God, the Father, and kept for Jesus Christ. Verse 1. He's writing to a group of people that he calls beloved, those that are kept in Jesus Christ. We don't really know much about where it was written. More than likely the Palestine area, because that's where Joseph and Mary lived, and probably even was probably written, maybe it could have even been written actually in Jerusalem. But it does have a universal message to be utilized by all Christians in all ages and places, though it was obviously written to meet a local need. And as you read the first couple of verses, you get a sense that Jude was starting out writing about one thing, and now all of a sudden he shifts. I think verse 3, Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. He was going to start writing to them about their common salvation, something to go along with that. And then all of a sudden something has happened, and now he's writing a different letter to them, telling them to contend earnestly for the faith. So what do you think that probably is going on here? That false teachers, we just talked about in the other two books. Yeah, the very next verse. For certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation. Ungodly men who turn the grace of our God to lewdness and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ. False teachers again. Jude is doing the same thing that John was doing in those two, 2nd and 3rd John. Beware of these false teachers. They are out there all over the place. They're trying to creep into the church. Actually, they're even in the church, and they're coming up inside of the church. They're not even coming from the outside. They're coming from within. It seems to be, from some of the scholars found, that the churches generally, both in Palestine and Asia Minor, were constantly under attack from false teachers during this time. And so much of the New Testament was written to refute the various heresies which arose from time to time. Again, on this one, we don't know the exact date of the writing. Most of the scholars agree that it was written in the latter half of the 1st century, about the same time as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, around this 90 AD period. Again, the theme that seems to be going throughout most of the book of Jude is contending for the faith. And again, we have heard so many lessons, so many comments about the faith. one faith. There's not multiple faiths. There's one. The one that was preached, taught by Jesus Christ, his gospel. What is faith? Well, I found an interesting comment by Guyan Woods. He says it's the sum of all that Christians are to believe and obey. Faith. Purpose of the book seems to be encouraging the brethren to contend for the faith, again, that was being attacked by the false teachers. Emphasize the fate of false teachers, meaning that they are out to be condemned, judgment, eternal destruction, eternal fire, sin into blackness, darkness. There is a special place being held for false teachers. And then to encourage the brethren to build each other up in the most holy faith. Again, to build us up in the faith. Wow, we got about 4 minutes to go through Revelation. Sorry. I'm just going to give you some tidbits on Revelation. Again, we could spend a year in Revelation. So much in Revelation. Written by Apostle John, of course. We already know that. Around 91 to 96 AD, while he was exiled on the Isle of Patmos. Patmos was an island with about a 20-mile circumference, about 50 square miles. It was rocky, it was barren, it was desolate. It was not a place that you want to go on your vacation. Okay, it was reserved for prisoners, for people that were exiled by the government, that the government thought were criminals, or if they just didn't like them. They put them out there. And it's pretty well believed that John died from natural causes while being on the Isle of Patmos. But just remember, really the theme of Revelation again, and I think we've talked about this a few different times, is that God wins. God is victorious. You know, you see so much in this talking about Satan and devil and the dragon and all this, and we know that this is, referring to Rome, the Roman Empire that was coming into play here, that was already in power and pretty much at the peak of their power at this point in time. God wins. We can obtain a glorious crown. We can attain that eternal life, victory, that crown of life. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Revelation 2:10. We quote that all the time at the end of almost every service. It reassures Christians, it's reassurance to Christians who were suffering, especially those in the first century. That's primarily who it was written to. Those in the first century that were dealing with all these false teachers, that were dealing with these Roman emperors that were coming into play. And maybe we can talk about them for just a second. It's a reminder of everybody as who is in control. God in control. It's a recommended course of action to the suffering saints. It provides a reward for the faithful. It provides a record of war between good and evil, God and Satan, the church and Rome. It's a record of what took place during this time. And you've got to have a little bit of history knowledge to fully understand it. We need to know some of the backgrounds that was going on that was facing the Christians in the first century. We know that, again, Rome was pretty much at the peak of their power at this point in time. The first emperor to target Christians was Nero from 54 to 68 AD. His first half of his reign was moderate. People had to offer sacrifices to the image of Nero. He blamed the Christians for the Great Fire in Rome in AD 64. He persecuted, the persecution he inflicted was not strictly against just the Christians. It was widespread. But he was a very ruthless leader, and he put many Christians to death. And then right after this, you get another one that comes into power, Domitian, from 81 to about 96 AD. And he insisted on being called Lord God, and images of him were to be made out of gold and had a certain weight to them, a certain specific look to them. And he cruelly persecuted Christians in and out of Rome, punished many by putting them into exile, like John. He is believed to have killed over 40,000 Christians. Then the next one that comes on the scene is Diocletian. Yeah, from about 284 to 305 AD. Again, offered Christians as sacrifices, beat them, beheaded them. So you got this period of time in the first century and beyond, about 249 years, that all this persecution is going on, that these Christians are having to suffer through and endure. And that's what John is writing to in Revelation, telling them to endure this. There's something better to come. You can overcome this, and even if your life is taken from you, you have a promise of a better hope. That's really the gist of Revelation. There is a better hope. There's hope, no matter what happens to us. We made it through quick. I had a few other comments, but we'll just let those go. So we will